Hello, this is Morel Bernard with the continuation of the story, Secret Adversary. Last words were that. It sure is, drawled Tuppence, especially when old man Rylesdale backs the bill. But don't fret, son. If this goes well, you shall come in on the ground floor. With which promise she took leave of her new ally and walked briskly away from South Audley Mansions, well pleased with her morning's work. But there was no time to be lost. She went straight back to the Ritz and wrote a few brief words to Mr. Carter. Having dispatched this, and Tommy not having yet returned, which did not surprise her, she started off on a shopping expedition which, with an interval for tea and assorted creamy cakes, occupied her until well after 6 o'clock, and she returned to the hotel jaded, but satisfied with her purchases. Starting with a cheap clothing store and passing through one or two second-hand establishments, she'd finished the day at a well-known hairdresser's. Now in the seclusion of her bedroom, she unwrapped that final purchase. 5 minutes later, she smiled contentedly at her reflection in the glass. With an actress's pencil, she had slightly altered the line of her eyebrows, and that, taken in conjunction with the new luxuriant growth of fair hair above, so changed her appearance that she felt confident that even if she came face to face with Whittington, he would not recognize her. She would wear elevators in her shoes, and the cap and apron would be an even more valuable disguise. From hospital experience, she knew only too well that a nurse out of uniform is frequently unrecognized by her patients. "Yes," said Tuppence aloud, nodding at the pert reflection in the glass. "You'll do." Then she resumed her normal appearance. Dinner was a solitary meal. Tuppence was rather surprised at Tommy's non-return. Julius, too, was absent. But that to the girl's mind was more easily explained. His hustling activities were not confined to London, and his abrupt appearances and disappearances were fully accepted by the young adventurers as part of the day's work. It was quite on the cards that Julius P. Hershmeyer had left for Constantinople at a moment's notice if he fancied that a clue to his cousin's disappearance was to be found there. The energetic young man had succeeded in making the lives of several Scotland Yard men unbearable to them, and the telephone girls at the Admiralty had learned to know and dread the familiar hello. He had spent 3 hours in Paris hustling the prefecture, and had returned from there imbued with the idea, possibly inspired by a wary French official, that the true clue to the mystery was to be found in Ireland. "I dare say he's dashed off there now," thought Tuppence. "All very well, but this is very dull for me. Here I am, bursting with news and absolutely no one to tell it to. Well, Tommy might have wired or something. I wonder where he is. Anyway, he can't have lost the trail, as they say. That reminds me." And Miss Cowley broke off in her meditations and summoned a small boy. 10 minutes later, the lady was ensconced comfortably on her bed, smoking cigarettes and deep in the perusal of Garnaby Williams, the boy detective, which, with other threepenny words of lurid fiction, she had sent out to purchase. She felt, and rightly, that before the strain of attempting further intercourse with Albert, it would be as well to fortify herself with a good supply of local colour. The morning brought a note from Mr. Carter. Dear Miss Tuppence, you have made a splendid start, and I congratulate you. I feel, though, that I should like to point out to you once more the risk you are running, especially if you pursue the course you indicate. Those people are absolutely desperate and incapable of either mercy or pity. I feel that you probably underestimate the danger, and therefore warn you again that I can promise you no protection. You have given us valuable information, and if you choose to withdraw now, no one could blame you. At any rate, think the matter over well before you decide. If, in spite of my warnings, you make up your mind to go through with it, you will find everything arranged. You have lived for 2 years with Miss Dunferin, the parsonage, Luneley, and Mrs. Vandermeyer can apply to her for a reference. May I be permitted a word or two of advice? Stick as near to the truth as possible. It minimizes the danger of slips. I suggest that you should represent yourself to be what you are, a former VAD, who has chosen domestic service as a profession. There are many such at the present time. That explains away any incongruities of voice or manner which otherwise might awaken suspicion. Whichever way you choose or decide, good luck to you. Your sincere friend, Mr. Carter. Tuppence's spirits rose mercurially. Mr. Carter's warnings passed unheeded. The young lady had far too much confidence in herself to pay any heed to them. With some reluctance, she abandoned the interesting part she had sketched out for herself, although she had no doubts of her own powers to sustain a role indefinitely. She had too much common sense not to recognize the force of Mr. Carter's arguments. There was still no word or message from Tommy, but the morning post brought a somewhat dirty postcard with the words, "It's okay," scrawled upon it. At 10:30, Tuppence surveyed with pride a slightly battered tin trunk containing her new possessions. It was artistically corded. It was with a slight blush that she rang the bell and ordered it to be placed in a taxi. She drove to Paddington and left the box in the cloakroom. She then repaired with a handbag to the fastnesses of the ladies' waiting room. 10 minutes later, a metamorphosed Tuppence walked demurely out of the station and entered a bus. It was a few minutes past 11 when Tuppence again entered the hall of South Audley Mansions. Albert was on the lookout, attending to his duties in a somewhat desultory fashion. He did not immediately recognize Tuppence. When he did, his admiration was unbounded. "Blessed! If I'd known you! That rig's out top hole." "Glad you like it, Albert," replied Tuppence modestly. "By the way, am I your cousin, or am I not?" "Your voice, too," cried the delighted boy. "It's as English as anything." "No, I said as a friend of mine knew a young gal, and he wasn't best pleased. She stopped on till today to oblige, she said, but really it's so as to put you against the place." "Nice girl," said Tuppence. Albert suspected no irony. She's style about her and keeps her silver a treat, but my word, ain't she got a temper? Are you going up now, miss? Step inside the lift. Number 20, did you say? And he winked. Tuppence quelled him with a stern glance and stepped inside. As she rang the bell of number 20, she was conscious of Albert's eyes slowly descending beneath the level of the floor. A smart young woman opened the door. "I've come about the place," said Tuppence. "It's a rotten place," said the young woman without hesitation. "Regular old cat always interfering. Accused me of tampering with her letters. Me! The flap was half undone anyway. There's never anything in the waste paper basket. She burns everything. She's a wrong one. That's what she is. Swell clothes, but no class. Cook knows something about her, but she won't tell. Scared to death of her. And suspicious. She's on to you in a minute if you as much as speak to a fella, I can tell you." But what more Annie could tell, Tuppence was never destined to learn. For at that moment a clear voice with a peculiarly steely ring to it called, "Annie?" The smart young woman jumped as if she had been shot. "Yes, ma'am." "Who are you talking to?" "It's a young woman about the situation, ma'am." "Show her in, then, at once." "Yes, ma'am." Tuppence was ushered into a room on the right of the long passage. A woman was standing by the fireplace. She was no longer in her first youth, and the beauty she undeniably possessed was hardened and coarsened. In her youth she must have been dazzling. Her pale gold hair, owing a slight assistance to art, was coiled low on her neck. Her eyes of a piercing electric blue seemed to possess the faculty of boring into the very soul of the person she was looking at. Her exquisite figure was enhanced by a wonderful gown of indigo chemise. And yet, despite her swaying grace and the almost ethereal beauty of her face, you felt instinctively the presence of something hard and menacing, a kind of metallic strength that found expression in the tones of her voice and in that gimlet-like quality of her eyes. For the first time, Tuppence felt afraid. She had not feared Whittington, but this woman was different. As if fascinated, she watched the long, cruel line of the red, curving mouth, and again she felt that sensation of panic pass over her. Her usual self-confidence deserted her. Vaguely she felt that deceiving this woman would be very different to deceiving Whittington. Mr. Carter's warning recurred to her mind. Here indeed she might expect no mercy. Fighting down that instinct of panic which urged her to turn tail and run without further delay, Tuppence returned the lady's gaze firmly and respectfully. As though that first scrutiny had been satisfactory, Mrs. Vandermeyer motioned to a chair. "You can sit down. How did you hear I wanted a house parlour-maid?" "Through a friend who knows the lift boy here. He thought the place might suit me." Again that basilisk glance seemed to pierce her through. "You speak like an educated girl." Glibly enough, Tuppence ran through her imaginary career on the line suggested by Mr. Carter. It seemed to her as she did so that the tension of Mrs. Vandermeyer's attitude relaxed. "I see," she remarked at length. "Is there anyone I can write to for a reference?" I lived last with a Miss Differin, the parsonage, Lineny. I was with her 2 years. And then you thought you would get more money by coming to London, I suppose. Well, it doesn't matter to me. I will give you 50, 60, whatever you want. You can come in at once. Yes, ma'am. Today, if you like. My box is at Paddington. Go and fetch it in a taxi then. It's an easy place. I'm out a good deal, by the way. What's your name? Prudence Cooper, ma'am. Very well, Prudence. Go away and fetch your box. I shall be out to lunch. The cook will show you where everything is. Thank you, ma'am. Tuppence withdrew. The smart Annie was not in evidence. In the hall below, a magnificent hall porter had relegated Albert to the background. Tuppence did not even glance at him as she passed meekly out. The adventure had begun, but she felt less elated than she had done early in the morning. It crossed her mind that if the unknown Jane Finn had fallen into the hands of Mrs. Vandermeyer, it was likely to have gone hard with her. Tuppence betrayed no awkwardness in her new duties. The daughters of the Archdeacon were well grounded in household tasks. They were also experts in training a raw girl. The inevitable result being that the raw girl, once trained, departed elsewhere, where her newly acquired knowledge commanded a more substantial remuneration than the Archdeacon's meagre purse allowed. Tuppence had therefore very little fear of proving inefficient. Mrs. Vandermeyer's cook puzzled her. She evidently went in deadly terror of her mistress. The girl thought it probable that the other woman had some hold over her. For the rest, she cooked like a chef, as Tuppence had an opportunity of judging that evening. Mrs. Vandermeyer was expecting a guest to dinner, and Tuppence accordingly laid the beautifully polished table for two. She was a little exercised in her own mind as to this visitor. It was highly possible that it might prove to be Whittington. Although she felt fairly confident that he would not recognize her, yet she would have been better pleased had the guest proved to be a total stranger. However, there was nothing for it but to hope for the best. At a few minutes past 8, the front door bell rang, and Tuppence went to answer it with some inward trepidation. She was relieved to see that the visitor was the second of the two men whom Tommy had taken upon himself to follow. He gave his name as Count Stepnoth. Tuppence announced him, and Mrs. Vandermeyer rose from her seat on a low divan with a quick murmur of pleasure. "It is delightful to see you, Boris Ivanovich," she said. "And you, madame," he bowed low over her hand. Tuppence returned to the kitchen. "Count Stepanov, or some such," she remarked, and affecting a frank and unvarnished curiosity. "Who's he?" "A Russian gentleman, I believe." "Come here much?" "Once in a while. What do you want to know for?" "Fancy he might be sweet on the missus, that's all," explained the girl, adding with an appearance of sulkiness, "How you do take one up." "I'm not quite easy in my mind about the soufflé," explained the other. "You know something," thought Tuppence to herself, but aloud she only said, "Going to dish up now, righto?" Whilst waiting at table, Tuppence listened closely to all that was said. She remembered that this was one of the men Tommy was shadowing when she had last seen him. Already, although she would hardly admit it, she was becoming uneasy about her partner. Where was he? Why had no word of any kind come from him? She had arranged before leaving the Ritz to have all letters or messages sent on at once by special messenger to a small stationer's shop near at hand, where Albert was to call infrequently. True, it was only yesterday morning that she had parted from Tommy, and she told herself that any anxiety on his behalf would be absurd. Still, it was strange that he had sent no word of any kind. But listen as she might, the conversation presented no clue. Boris and Mrs. Vandermeyer talked on purely indifferent subjects, plays they had seen, new dances, and the latest society gossip. After dinner, they repaired to the small boudoir, where Mrs. Vandermeyer, stretched on the divan, looked more wickedly beautiful than ever. Tuppence brought in the coffee and liquors and unwillingly retired. As she did so, she heard Boris say, "New, isn't she? She came in today. The other was a friend. This girl seems all right. She waits well." Tuppence lingered a moment longer by the door, which she had carefully neglected to close, and heard him say, "Quite safe, I suppose? Really, Boris, you are absurdly suspicious. I believe she's the cousin of the hall porter or something of the kind. And nobody even dreams that I have any connection with our mutual friend, Mr. Brown." "For heaven's sake, be careful, Rita. That door isn't shut." "Well, shut it then," laughed the woman. Tuppence removed herself speedily. She dared not absent herself longer from the back premises, but she cleared away and washed up with a breathless speed acquired in hospital. Then she slipped quietly back to the boudoir door. The cook, more leisurely, was still busy in the kitchen, and if she missed the other, would only suppose her to be turning down the beds. Alas, the conversation itself was being carried on in too low a tone to permit of her hearing anything of it. She dared not reopen the door, however gently. Mrs. Vandermeyer was sitting almost facing it, and Tuppence respected her mistress' lynx eye powered of observation. Nevertheless, she felt she would give a good deal to overhear what was going on. Possibly, if anything unforeseen had happened, she might get news of Tommy. For some moments she reflected desperately, then her face brightened. She went quickly along the passage to Mrs. Vandermeyer's bedroom, which had long French windows leading onto a balcony that ran the length of the flat. Slipping quickly through the window, Tuppence crept noiselessly along till she reached the boudoir window. As she had thought, it stood a little ajar, and the voices within were plainly audible. Tuppence listened attentively, but there was no mention of anything that could be twisted to apply to Tommy. Mrs. Vandermeer and the Russian seemed to be at variance over some matter, and finally the latter exclaimed bitterly, "With your persistent recklessness you will end by ruining us." "Ah," laughed the woman, "notoriety of the right kind is the best way of disarming suspicion. You will realize that one of these days, perhaps sooner than you think. In the meantime, you are going about everywhere with Peel Egerton. Not only is he perhaps the most celebrated KC in England, but his special hobby is criminology. It is madness. I know that is eloquence has saved untold men from the gallows, said Mrs. Vandermeyer calmly. What of it? I may need his assistance in that line myself some day. If so, how fortunate to have such a friend at court, or perhaps it would be more to the point to say, in court. Boris got up and began striding up and down. He was very excited. You are a clever woman, Rita, but you are also a fool. Be guided by me, and give up Peel Egerton. Mrs. Vandermeyer shook her head gently. I think not. You refuse? There was an ugly ring in the Russian's voice. I do. Then by heaven, snarled the Russian, we will see. But Mrs. Vandermeyer also rose to her feet, her eyes flashing. You forget, Boris, she said. I am accountable to no one. I take my orders only from Mr. Brown. The other threw up his hands in despair. You are impossible, he muttered, impossible. Already it may be too late. They say Peel Egerton can smell the criminal. How do we know what is at the bottom of his sudden interest in you? Perhaps even now his suspicions are aroused. He guesses. Mrs. Vandermeyer eyed him scornfully. Reassure yourself, my dear Boris. He suspects nothing. With less than your usual chivalry, you seem to forget that I am commonly accounted a beautiful woman. I assure you that is all that interests Peel Egerton. Boris shook his head doubtfully. He has studied crime as no other man in this kingdom has studied it. Do you fancy that you can deceive him? Mrs. Vandermeyer's eyes narrowed. If he is all that you say, it would amuse me to try. Good heavens, Rita! Besides, added Mrs. Vandermeyer, he is extremely rich. I am not one who despises money. The sinews of war, you know, Boris. Money, money. That is always the danger with you, Rita. I believe you would sell your soul for money. I believe. He paused, then in a low, sinister voice, he said slowly, sometimes I believe that you would sell us. Join me. Join me for the next video. Join me for the next video of Secret Adversary. I'll see you then. Join me next video, Secret Adversary.